Hey everyone, and welcome to class. I am absolutely thrilled you're joining me for today's explainer. We are going to be taking a really fascinating descent from the bright, everyday internet you and I are so used to, straight down into the hidden, highly encrypted, and honestly fundamentally dual-sided ecosystem known as the dark web. Forget the whole Hollywood hacker movie tropes for a second. Today, we're looking at the actual architecture, the data, the criminals, and surprisingly enough, the journalists who operate in these shadows. So let's just dive right into this. To really understand the sheer scale of what we're talking about today, I want you to consider this number, 500. Researchers and cybersecurity experts, including those over at ISACA, estimate that the deep web could be 500 times larger than the normal web. Just wrap your head around that. The vast majority of the internet isn't some public square. It's actually a series of locked doors. But to truly map this all out, we really need to get our terminology straight first, because deep web and dark web get confused constantly. Okay, so the absolutely crucial point here is understanding these three distinct layers. First up, we have the surface web. That's everything indexed by search engines. Basically, it's what you Google. Then, below that, we have the massive deep web. This is simply anything hidden behind authentication. Think your bank accounts, academic databases, corporate intranets. It requires a username and a password, not a special browser. And then finally, the dark web. This is actually a really tiny fraction of that unindexed web, made up of private portals that require very specific, highly encrypted gateways just to access. Now, what I find profoundly ironic about the dark web's origin story is that the exact same infrastructure hosting massive illegal marketplaces today was actually pioneered by the government. In the late 1960s, the U.S. Department of Defense developed ARPANET to decentralize communications during the Cold War. Then, fast forward to the 1990s, the layered encryption concepts we now totally associate with the dark web were developed by the U.S. Naval Research Lab to protect military communications. It was built for state security. But as it turns out, the technology was just too powerful to stay contained. So that history brings us to a very practical question for our class today. If this hidden layer of the internet isn't indexed by Google, and it requires specialized layered encryption, how do everyday people, whether we're talking about dissidents, journalists, or cybercriminals, how do they actually dive into the dark? Well, the answer lies in decentralized gateways. You can't just type a .com address into your standard browser and expect to get there. You need specialized software. We're talking gateways like Tor, ZeroNet, I2P, or Freenet. These operate on peer-to-peer networks. And this decentralization is key. It means there is no single repository of registered domains and absolutely no single point of failure. It's designed from the ground up to be highly censorship resistant. But you should know, these gateways are definitely not all created equal. Let's compare two of the most prominent ones really quick. Tor is arguably the easiest and most popular gateway out there, boasting millions of daily users. It supports multiple platforms, including Android, and it uses a system of at least 3 relays to scramble and encrypt your traffic before you ever hit a website. On the flip side, you have I2P, which uses a highly secure method called garlic routing. Now, it's incredibly secure, but because of that heavy encryption, it is notoriously slow. But here is the critical lesson for you to take away. Regardless of whether you use Tor or I2P, human behavior is almost always the weakest link. Reusing usernames or casually oversharing personal details will de-anonymize a user way faster than any cryptographic failure ever could. So if the very foundation of this entire ecosystem is built on decentralization, bulletproof hosting, and total anonymity, it really begs the question, how do cybersecurity experts and intelligence researchers actually track what's going on down there? How do you map a digital city that actively doesn't want to be found? This is where we get into cyber intelligence tools, like Black Widow. This brilliantly illustrates how researchers automate the collection of dark web data. It's heavily inspired by traditional intelligence gathering. So the cycle starts with planning and identifying target forums, then it moves to collection, where it establishes anonymous access. From there, it processes the raw HTML, translates it, and finally analyzes that data to infer relationships before spitting it all out into visual dashboards. Because human monitoring is just way too slow, this kind of high-grade automation is absolutely essential. Let's see how this raw data actually builds into actionable intelligence. The Black Widow process yields what's called a knowledge graph. It doesn't just scrape a bunch of text, it actively builds a map. It visually links a user to the message they posted, the specific thread it belongs to, and the broader topic it covers. By looking at the number of threads in which different users are active together, researchers can basically map out relationships and identify key players in communities that, remember, possess no traditional friend or follower buttons whatsoever. And when researchers apply these massive data collection techniques to the dark web over a really long period of time, they discover something quite chilling. The cybercrime ecosystem on the dark web isn't some chaotic, lawless Wild West like you might think. It is actually structurally concentrated and thematically persistent. It operates way more like a well-oiled, highly stable corporate machine dominated by long-standing topics. A longitudinal analysis of this cybercrime ecosystem reveals something staggering. Check this out. 53% of all discussion volume is concentrated in just the top 5 topics. And the top 20 topics, they account for over 88% of all content. This proves that cybercrime ecosystems evolve through gradual, calculated shifts in existing topics, rather than erratic chaos. It's this exact corporate-like stability that allows groups like the Play ransomware gang to completely thrive, systematically stealing corporate data and confidently directing your victims to contact them via Tor-based dark web leak sites. Okay, so we've clearly seen how cybercriminals use the space. But remember what I said at the beginning? The dark web is a dual-sided coin. What happens when the bad guys hack other bad guys or leak corrupt government data and then hand that information over to an investigative reporter? Let's flip the script. It is absolutely crucial to remember that the dark web provides fundamental human rights tools. For individuals living under oppressive regimes, gateways like Tor often provide the literal only safe haven for free speech. They provide life-saving anonymity for whistleblowers and secure communication channels for journalists who are desperately trying to hold the powerful accountable. The exact same encryption that hides a ransomware gang is also what protects a dissident's life. Veteran data journalists like Jan Strozek from the OCCRP actually have specific workflows to navigate the shadowy space. First, they actively monitor hacker Telegram groups. Second, they track dark web sites like RansomLook and RansomWatch for newly leaked datasets. But here's the real kicker. Strozek navigates these shadowy groups using his real name, openly identifying himself as a journalist. Being completely transparent about his identity immediately scares away bad actors who don't want to follow journalistic rules, which acts as this incredible first filter for finding genuine public interest leaks. And sometimes dipping into this black market is literally the only way to expose the truth. Take the chilling case of the poisoning of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny. When traditional law enforcement completely refused to investigate, the journalism group Bellingcat stepped in. They actually paid data brokers on the dark web for black market flight records. By matching Navalny's travel patterns with this illicit data, journalists were able to identify the actual state agents responsible for the assassination attempt. Unbelievable, right? But purchasing black market data or downloading gigabytes of files stolen by a ransomware gang forces us to ask a very, very uncomfortable question. When a journalist uses this data, is it just an amazing scoop, or are they actively participating in a crime? Let's talk ethics for a minute, because modern journalism is currently navigating some incredibly murky waters here. The primary journalistic defense for handling hacked information really comes down to one absolute standard: overwhelming public interest. Lorix Horn, who is an editor at the journalism collective DDoS Secrets, which is a group that curates leaked data, stated it perfectly. They said, if it doesn't have public interest value, we will discard it. The data cannot just be interesting or embarrassing gossip. It absolutely must expose corruption, public danger, or vital truths that society simply has a right to know. However, as journalist James Ball points out, the motivation of the source deeply, deeply matters. Journalists must constantly evaluate exactly who gave them the data. Are they dealing with a principled whistleblower, a hacker just seeking petty revenge, or maybe a corporation trying to completely destroy a rival? Newsrooms have to carefully navigate these shadowy motivations, verifying the data rigorously to ensure they aren't just becoming the free publishing arm for a criminal's personal vendetta. Class, as we bring our explainer back to the surface web today, let's take a look at the complete picture here. The dark web is the ultimate dual-sided ecosystem. It was born out of U.S. military research, yet today it hosts highly structured, incredibly stable cybercrime economies. But simultaneously, it serves as an absolute goldmine for investigative journalists and remains the ultimate, and sometimes the only, privacy tool for oppressed citizens around the entire globe. It is a technology that is completely devoid of morality, shaped entirely by the human behavior utilizing it. So I want to leave you with this final, somewhat provocative thought to chew on. In an increasingly surveilled digital world, the dark web might truly be the last refuge for real anonymity. So we have to ask ourselves, are the rampant cyber threats and illicit marketplaces simply the necessary price we have to pay to guarantee freedom of speech and the protection of whistleblowers? Think about that trade-off. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll see you next time.